Barrett Paul was 22 years old when he arrived at a mansion in the Hamptons in 2011. He was an aspiring model recruited by an older man who had promised him an opportunity, something about meeting the executives at Abercrombie Fitch, one of the most recognizable clothing brands in the world. For a young aspiring model, that is the chance of a lifetime. But what happened inside that mansion would break him. He couldn't leave. There was no transportation. He was pressured into situations he never agreed to, like kissing an elderly man. He also watched as other young men were exploited by the people who had promised them careers. In interviews with BBC, Paul described the experience as something that stole his innocence and left him mentally scarred for years. And the elderly man orchestrating all of this in that mansion was Mike Jeffries, the former CEO of Abercrombie Fitch and one of the most powerful figures in American retail. He's a man who transformed a failing outfitter into a $4 billion empire built on exclusivity, sex appeal, and the worship of youth and young bodies. For over 2 decades, Mike Jeffries operated at the highest levels of American fashion. He decided who was cool and who wasn't, and according to federal prosecutors, he was running something else behind closed doors: an international sex trafficking operation. In October of 2024, Mike Jeffries was arrested on 16 federal counts: trafficking, interstate crimes, and for designing a scheme that allegedly lured dozens of young men with promises of modeling careers. He flew them to luxury locations around the world, then confiscated their phones and wallets, drugged them, and coerced them into situations prosecutors called events. And Mike Jeffries' partner, Matthew Smith, was arrested with him, and so was their alleged recruiter, James Jacobson, a man victims describe as having a missing nose covered by a snakeskin patch. The youngest victim of this operation was 19 years old, and a class action filed against Jeffries and Abercrombie Fitch could involve more than 100 victims. This is the story of how one of America's most exclusive brands became a front for exploitation, and how a brand god used his empire to prey on the vulnerable. Before Mike Jeffries came along and made Abercrombie Fitch cool, the company was dead. Founded in 1892 in Manhattan, Abercrombie Fitch spent a century as an elite sporting goods store. At this point, it was not a clothing brand for teenagers. This was the outfitter of choice for America's elite adventures. Teddy Roosevelt bought his safari gear there. Ernest Hemingway purchased his fishing equipment. Charles Lindbergh shopped there before his famous transatlantic flight, and the original store on Madison Avenue was a monument to masculine adventure. It's 12 stories of guns, fishing rods, tents, and taxidermy. But by the 70s, the world had changed entirely, and Americans didn't need safari gear. They wanted convenience, and discount retailers were eating into the market. And in 1977, Abercrombie Fitch declared bankruptcy. Then Les Wexner, the CEO of The Limited, a retail conglomerate that also owned Victoria's Secret, and yes, you definitely recognize Les Wexner with the Epstein files as well, Old Lex bought the corpse in 1988 for $47 million. And it was a bet on nostalgia and on the power of an old name. But for years, nobody at The Limited could figure out what to do with it. The brand was completely dead. The stores were half empty, and the identity was confused. Then, in 1992, Mike Jeffries entered the picture. Jeffries at the time was 48 years old and a retail veteran who'd worked for Paul Harris Stores and Alcott & Andrews, which was a brand that filed for bankruptcy in 1989 with Jeffries as president. He wasn't a fashion icon, he wasn't a household name, but he had a vision for what Abercrombie could become, and that was something completely different from what it had been. No outdoor gear, no camping equipment, not nostalgia for a bygone era of American adventurism. Throw all of that out and instead introduce a lifestyle brand for teenagers. He wanted to create something aspirational for the youth. He wanted to build something exclusive, and above all, he wanted it to be sexy. That's like their whole thing. And when Jeffries took over, Abercrombie had 36 stores generating about $50 million in annual sales. The company was completely bleeding money. Most retail executives would have tried to stabilize things to then stop the hemorrhaging, but Jeffries did something else entirely. He burnt it all down and built something completely new. And by the time he left, 22 years later, Abercrombie Fitch, along with Abercrombie Kids and their other popular brand Hollister, had nearly 969 locations worldwide with revenue that exceeded $4 billion. And the name Abercrombie had become synonymous with a very specific kind of American cool. I'm wearing a Dr. Pepper shirt, so I obviously don't fit that bill. But transformation was complete and total. Jeffries didn't just change what Abercrombie sold, he changed what Abercrombie & Fitch meant. And if you grew up in America in the late 90s or early 2000s, as I did, you remember what walking into an Abercrombie & Fitch store or a Hollister store felt like. Going to the mall. The experience was designed to overwhelm you from the moment you approached. Windows were covered with shutters, so you couldn't see inside from the mall. You had to walk in to commit. You had to walk in blind. Then once inside, the lights were dim, so dim that you could barely see the tags. The darkness was apparently intentional. It made the stores feel like a club and less like a retail space. Then there was the music. The music was very loud. It wasn't background music. It was club beats with thumping bass, loud enough that conversations were difficult, and if you wanted to ask an employee a question, you had to kind of shout. This was all done in a calculated way and on purpose. It made parents uncomfortable, and it made teenagers feel like they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be. And then there was the cologne. Abercrombie's signature fragrance, a men's cologne called Fierce, was pumped through the ventilation system, which seems illegal and like a crime, but employees were instructed to spray it on clothing, fixtures, and everywhere. The scent was so powerful that it hit you before you walked through the door. It was a love it or hate it. I hated it. That was the point though, I guess. If you hated it, you weren't the target audience of Abercrombie & Fitch. Comment down below your experience with this type of thing and that sort of fashion icon sense of the 2000s that you experience in malls. As a homeschooled idiot inside face, I had zero experience with it. I was a complete and total loser, so it didn't really jive with me, to be honest. But were some of you fully in on it, or were you more kind of UGG style, or maybe, I don't know, I'm kind of Americana pipe dream right now. It's kind of my vibe. The cherry on top for Abercrombie & Fitch was at the entrance greeting every customer who walked into these stores, which not the one that was in my mall, to be honest, but in a lot of them was a shirtless young man with perfect abs, which is very interesting. These shirtless young men were not just employees. Jeffries called them models, and they appeared at flagship stores. Male greeters went shirtless with their sculpted torsos on display as if they were merchandise themselves. Female employees wore tight, revealing versions of the store's clothes and had to be comfortable showing a lot of skin. These models were there to embody a fantasy, to make you feel like buying Abercrombie clothes would make you look like them, to make that exclusivity feel attainable if you had the money and the right body, obviously. Mike Jeffries, the guy at the head of all this, was obsessive about every single detail, which to a guy like me doesn't seem that important, but you know, I'm not running a sex trafficking operation internationally, so. In 2006, a journalist named Benoit Denizet-Lewis wrote a profile of Mike Jeffries for Salon magazine. What Jeffries said in that interview would define his legacy. He said, "We hire good-looking people in our stores," Jeffries told him, "because good-looking people attract other good-looking people, and we want to market to cool, good-looking people. We don't want to market to anyone other than that." So, getting kind of a better idea of this whole thing. What about people who didn't fit that description? What about customers who were overweight or older or didn't match the Abercrombie aesthetic? Jeffries didn't give a f. He said, "Candidly, we go after the cool kids. We go after the attractive all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. A lot of people don't belong in our clothes, and they can't belong. Are we exclusionary? Absolutely." That seems very f***ed up and weird and evil and shallow and just so like Zoolander, but in real life, literally.
Who cares about Derek Zoolander anyway? The man has only one look, for Christ's sake.
It seems to be the classic comedic CEO of a fashion company, Mugatu. He's basically Mugatu. And this was not a CEO of a company saying something awkward in an unguarded way, getting caught slipping up. This is their entire marketing strategy stated very plainly in a magazine when asked. Jeffries believed that making people feel excluded made the brand more desirable. Scarcity creates value. Economics 101. If anyone could wear Abercrombie, no one would want to wear Abercrombie. The cruelty is a feature, not a boog. Teenagers wanted to wear the brand that made them feel cool, because that's what it's all about, dude. It's about the coolness, the cool factor, right? The exclusivity is the appeal. I want to be the Abercrombie & Fitch guy. I don't. But I imagine that's what people thought. Jeffries had rebuilt the entire corporate infrastructure of this company around identifying who was cool and who wasn't, and around finding attractive young people and bringing them into his orbit so they can make money for him, and around the worship of young, beautiful bodies. That's like the whole thing. At the corporate level, you're required to wear Abercrombie & Fitch, even if you didn't fit the clothes. Employees in the stores were even told to not apologize for not carrying plus sizes. That is a completely different corporate culture than any other business that exists in today's environment. I can tell you that. This infrastructure that Jeffries proposed would eventually serve a much darker purpose. Now, to further sell the Abercrombie lifestyle, Jeffries hired Bruce Weber. Weber was one of the most famous fashion photographers in the entire world. His black and white images had defined Calvin Klein campaigns in the 1980s, creating the modern concept of the male supermodel. His photos made men's bodies into art objects, like this one and this one of Mark Wahlberg, which I've seen a lot. I'm just gonna be real with you guys. In 1997, Jeffries and Weber created the A&F Quarterly, which was a publication that called itself a catalog but looked like a lifestyle magazine. It featured mostly naked male models and suggestive poses alongside articles about lifestyle, music, and celebrity interviews even. Photos weren't even selling clothes. The models weren't even wearing clothes. It looked less like a clothing catalog and more like softcore, gay, preppy porn. And that makes sense because I'm getting that it did appeal to gay men. And the Quarterly was controversial from the start. Groups protested and there were boycotts. And in 2003, after sustained pressure from advocacy groups, Abercrombie & Fitch finally stopped publishing the Quarterly. It launched here and stopped here. But by the time it stopped, it had already served its purpose. Abercrombie had become synonymous with a certain kind of American sexuality: young, male, beautiful, and exclusive. And of course, what nobody knew at the time, but some probably could have guessed, was that Bruce Weber himself, amongst other people, would later face serious allegations. In 2018, the New York Times detailed accusations from more than 15 male models who said that Weber had sexually assaulted or harassed them. Models described breathing exercises during photo shoots where Weber would touch their genitals, which was behavior that was so common in the industry that it had a nickname, getting Brucified. Now, in spite of this thing being so common that it had a nickname, with the guy's name in the nickname, Weber denied the allegations and settled many of the claims out of court. He has never been charged with a crime, but the accusations seemed to paint a picture of an industry where exploitation was normalized and where powerful men used their ability to make or break careers as leverage over young and vulnerable people, which it's a trope, it's a stereotype. We've all heard it, and it seems to be that there is quite a bit of a reality behind it. And this is all with saying nobody knew what Mike Jeffries was allegedly doing behind closed doors as well. The culture that Jeffries created at Abercrombie, with the obsession with young bodies, the hiring based on looks only, the sexualization of retail itself, it wasn't just marketing. According to prosecutors, it was a system that identified and groomed potential victims. It was part of the international trafficking operation. The next part of the story is understanding what Jeffries was doing to his own employees. Inside Abercrombie stores, employees weren't hired, they were cast. The company had something in their SOPs and policy called the look. It wasn't like a dress code or some kind of intuitive thing. Make sure they have the look. It was a policy. Employees were given a book outlining exactly what good-looking looks looked like. The guidelines were obsessively specific, ruling many potential employees completely out of the running. So you can see how this policy-level exclusion could create the idea of working at Abercrombie. It could seem like a status symbol. If you were hired, it meant you were attractive enough. You had the look. You were one of the cool kids. Now, there's tons of problems with this system. The definition of good looking in those training materials consistently targeted non-Caucasian features as undesirable. The all-American look was effectively the white guy look. And in 2003, a group of plaintiffs filed a class action lawsuit against Abercrombie & Fitch. It was Gonzalez versus Abercrombie. And it alleged that the company systematically discriminated against African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and women in hiring and promotion. The plaintiff class eventually grew to approximately 250,000 employees and applicants, and the case documented a pattern of discrimination that went beyond individual managers and making bad decisions. It was literally the company policy. The look policy that the company had was inherently discriminatory. And in 2005, Abercrombie settled for $40 million. The company agreed to hire a vice president for diversity and create marketing materials that featured minority models and monitor its hiring practices more closely with 25 recruiters that would seek out minority employees. So there's a huge settlement. They start to change. That doesn't in the lawsuits. In 2008, a 17-year-old Muslim girl named Samantha Ilauf applied for a job at an Abercrombie store in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She wore a hijab, which is a headscarf, as a part of her religious practice, and the hiring manager thought she was great. But when the manager asked the district manager whether the hijab was okay, the answer came back as no, and that it violated the look policy. Ilauf wasn't hired, and obviously you can see where this is going. That's a huge liability. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sued on her behalf. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 2015, in an 8-1 decision, the court ruled against Abercrombie. Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that the decision was really easy under the text of Title VII. Abercrombie paid Ilauf $25,670 in damages and $18,983 in court costs and was forced to revise its policies. Policy change was the bigger of the two punishments for the billion-dollar retail empire. For their scale, $20,000 ain't shit. These cases have revealed true intentions behind the company that Mike Jeffries built. Mike Jeffries' True Intentions. This is an organization where how you looked was absolutely everything, where managers approached strangers based on their appearance solely and recruited them like talent agents, where an entire infrastructure for a corporate entity existed to identify attractive young people and bring them in to the company. This infrastructure didn't just stop at the company store policy level. According to prosecutors, it extended all the way to Mike Jeffries himself, the brand god. Thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video. You know how every January we say we're gonna start prepping our own food, we're gonna get healthy. Then we chop veggies for 2 hours, cut our finger. Oh! And then in failure, go ahead and order a Hamburglar anyways. That is where Factor comes in. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted meals right to your front door. And they're genuinely delicious with a ton of different options to choose from. So no cooking, no dishes, you get a delicious meal delivered right to your door without having to think. No more, oh great, I burned the broccoli, now I smell farts. And I didn't even fart. You can choose calorie smart meals, low carb, keto, vegetarian, whatever you want. Lately, my favorite have been the Protein Plus meals because they have over 30 grams of protein in their serving size, which is incredible. And these meals are clean label. They don't use terrible dyes or anything like that, which is epic. So for this new season, if you want to eat intentionally without actually having to do all the work, Factor is the move. Head to factor75.com and use OOMPAFB50 as your discount code. You'll get 50% off your first box and free breakfast for a year. That's OOMPAFB50 at factor75.com. Click the link in the description. Let's get it. This is James Jacobson. As you can tell from this photo, he has a fairly distinctive appearance. He was missing most of his nose, and the result, he said, was of a surgery gone wrong. He wore a snakeskin patch to cover the disfigurement. Everyone who met him remembered it. According to the federal indictment, Jacobson was employed by Mike Jeffries and Matthew Smith for a specific purpose. That purpose was to recruit, to interview, and to hire young men to attend what prosecutors called sex events. Jacobson was 71 years old when he was arrested in October 2024 at his home in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. He'd been doing this job for years. This operation he helped run worked like a pyramid scheme, but with bodies, human bodies and flesh. Jacobson would travel throughout the United States and internationally searching for candidates. He built a network of sub-recruiters, people in modeling agencies, nightlife promoters, entertainment industry, hangers-on, anyone who had access to young men looking for a big break and who were attractive. These sub-recruiters were paid between $500 and $1,000 for every man they successfully referred to Jacobson. And if Jacobson approved the candidate, that referral fee was paid out like a bounty system. It's a pyramid scheme. When Jacobson found a potential candidate, whether through his network or his own scouting, he would reach out with an enticing offer and he'd dangle connections to Abercrombie & Fitch's executives, meetings with the company's official photographer, and modeling opportunities with one of America's biggest brand. He had a lot to offer these young people who were struggling to break into the modeling industry, which, by the way, is an industry that is notorious for exploitation and evil, broken promises, whatever you want to call it. But for a ton of people who are looking to start a career earnestly, these things sound like a chance of a lifetime. Genuine connections, real networking, real opportunities. Jacobson was someone who could actually open doors for these people. The only thing is there was a catch. Before any candidate could meet Mike Jeffries, they had to pass an audition with Jacobson. And according to the federal indictment, during these tryouts or auditions, Jacobson typically required candidates to engage in commercial sex acts with him first. Multiple victims described being asked or pressured to let Jacobson perform oral sex on them or perform oral sex on Jacobson before they could proceed to the next level. And if you refused, the opportunity would evaporate. And if you complied, Jacobson would forward your photos and information to Jeffries and Smith. If they approved, you would receive an invitation. In Jacobson's defense against the prosecution, he denied any coercive or deceptive or forceful behavior. Jacobson claimed he didn't remember making any promises of modeling opportunities, and any sexual encounter was consensual and not coercive. Of course, that's what he said. And guess what? The federal government disagrees, and so do the victims. David Bradbury was one of these victims, and he was 23 years old in 2010 when he was swept up into Jacobson's scheme, the AF evil scheme. Bradbury was an aspiring model trying to make it in this industry. He'd been working with an agent, doing some small jobs, waiting for his big break. Then his agent introduced him to someone who could change everything. Jacobson was the gatekeeper who made it clear that he was holding the keys to the Abercrombie kingdom. And if Bradbury wanted to model for A&F, and who wouldn't? It's one of the biggest brands in the country. Jacobson was the man to know. But according to Bradbury's lawsuit, the meeting with Jacobson quickly turned into something else. So Bradbury unfortunately had his encounter with Jacobson, and after this, Jacobson gave him $500. Then came the invitation to the Hamptons, where things would only get worse. Bradbury was told to purchase an Abercrombie & Fitch outfit for the occasion, and Jacobson provided a gift card. And when he arrived in the Hamptons at Jeffries' estate, he was greeted by staff wearing A&F uniforms. Everything looked legitimate. It was professional, like a corporate event. This was it. This was a big opportunity. Then Bradbury alleges upon meeting Jeffries that Jeffries held poppers under his nose. Poppers, if you don't know, are amyl nitrates, which is a muscle relaxing drug that causes disorientation, lowers inhibitions, and a head rush. They are commonly associated with the club and party scene, and they are technically legal. They're sold as room deodorizers or leather cleaners. And according to Bradbury and multiple victims, they were a standard part of what happened at Mike Jeffries' events. According to Bradbury's lawsuit, after being given the drug, Jeffries then had sex with him. He was 23 years old, he'd come looking for a modeling career, and instead, according to the Justice Department's indictment, he was one of the many men that were victimized in Jeffries' sex trafficking and prostitution business. So this recruitment that Bradbury was a part of was not random. According to prosecutors, it was a systematic thing with a network of employees, contractors, and more, all helping run a business that was dedicated to fulfilling these executives, these top guys' sexual desires. And once a candidate was approved by Jacobson and then by Jeffries and Smith, they'd receive travel itineraries. And these documents looked completely legitimate. They resembled those sent to model for photo shoots. Everything was a real business opportunity because that is what it was designed to look like. That's why it was a massive criminal enterprise. The destinations that they were to travel to were also very impressive. New York City, London, Paris, Venice, Morocco, St. Bart's. These are not shady motels on the outskirts of towns. These are luxury locations, the kind of places anybody would want to go. The indictment said that Jeffries and Smith spent millions of dollars to create a massive infrastructure around these events.
They spent millions of dollars on a massive infrastructure to support this operation and maintain its secrecy.
They would pay for flights, first class when possible, and they would cover accommodations. The young men who accepted these invitations believed they were taking a step towards their dreams, and many of them were financially very vulnerable, and the modeling industry doesn't pay well until you make it, and most never make it. So what actually happened at these events? When a young man would arrive, whether at Jeffries' $28 million estate in the Hamptons, a London motel suite, or a villa in Morocco, one of the first things that would happen would be confiscation. Participants were required to relinquish their personal items, including clothing, wallets, and cell phones. So you arrive at a remote location, maybe you've traveled thousands of miles, you don't know anybody, and immediately the things that would allow you to call for help or to leave or to document what's happening is taken from you. Participants were also physically groomed groomed before the events. This included being required to shave their bodies, and they were also given specific clothing to wear or told to wear nothing at all. After this, the men were not told what would happen. Half of the men who spoke to the BBC said that they had been initially misled about the nature of the events or were not told sex would be involved at all. They thought that they were attending a modeling event, a party, or a networking opportunity. Others did say they understood the events would be sexual in nature, but didn't know exactly what would be expected. And then came the drugs. I mentioned Jeffries and the amyl nitrates or poppers, but the drugs did not stop there. The indictment alleges that on more than one occasion, Jeffries and Smith directed others to inject or personally inject men with an erection-inducing substance directly into the penis for the purpose of causing the men to engage in sex acts the men were incapable or unwilling to engage in. Barrett Paul, from the top of this video, described being encouraged to go further because it would lead to better career opportunities, and compliance would open doors, refusal would close those doors. So you're drugged, isolated, no phone, no wallet, in a remote location with no way to leave, surrounded by staff who works for the man asking you to do these things, and then them telling the recruits you don't have to do anything you don't want to do, but then saying the further you go, the better, and the better for your career prospects. Everything is starting to paint a full picture. It is a real-life, non-ironic example of the implication scene from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
The whole purpose of buying the boat in the first place was to get the ladies nice and tipsy topside so we can take them to a nice, comfortable place below deck and, you know, they can't refuse because of the implication. There's nowhere for me to run. What am I gonna do, say no?
Jeffries and Smith would direct men to engage in various sex acts while they watched and participated. Multiple victims described being pressured to have sex with Jeffries and Smith and with each other while being observed. According to prosecutors, Jeffries and Smith would also intentionally recruit heterosexual men for these events, men with families and wives who are just trying to support them, and then forcing them to comply in their system of abuse. These events were not isolated incidents either. They took place over 7 years between December 2008 and March 2015, and those are the years that the primary victims from the indictment, John Does 1 through 15, were exploited, but there were dozens of men who were trafficked beyond just them. There were millions of dollars spent on infrastructure, travel, and payments, all to orchestrate this international sex trafficking ring from these three freaks. Now, how did it take so long for this to come out? Well, when the events were over, the men weren't just sent home. According to prosecutors, they were processed. Every participant was allegedly required to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, and these NDAs would prohibit them from sharing any information about these sex events, including with their own family and friends. You can't talk about the abuse you were coerced into or the sex trafficking ring you were coerced into. You signed a contract. If you talk, you can be sued, your career's over, everything would be destroyed for you. All this is according to the indictment, by the way. The way these agreements were laid out or designed was to prevent victims from seeking help and to secure their silence. The NDAs served another purpose as well. They made the whole operation look legitimate. Legitimate businesses use NDAs all the time. If a young man told a friend he'd signed a confidentiality agreement after a modeling event with a major company, that's not suspicious at all. It's professional and normal. It was this level of legitimacy that protected the operation and allowed it to go on for so long. Now, NDAs don't magically prevent someone from doing something. They have to be enforced, like any contract. Just because it says something in the contract doesn't mean anything unless the contract is enforced through, the court system, civilly. So what if someone wanted to talk? Jeffries and Smith had a solution for that. Prosecutors described a full-service security company that worked for this operation. It wasn't just private security guards following around these goobers or guarding doors. The company performed multiple functions. First, they would conduct background checks on potential participants before events, screening them to make sure the men weren't undercover journalists or weren't connected to law enforcement or the type who might cause problems. Second, they were administered the non-disclosure agreements. And third, and most disturbingly, this organization maintained surveillance and intimidation over the victims. When witnesses would threaten to expose or sue Jeffries and Smith, the security company was used to surveil and intimidate those individuals, thereby securing their silence. This is from the federal indictment. Now, it doesn't name the security company and it doesn't specify exactly what surveil and intimidate means, but that is a pretty chilling thing. This isn't just a bunch of rich dudes throwing parties, making people sign NDAs. Victims of these parties were actively monitored, followed, watched, investigated, and intimidated into keeping quiet to protect the international sex trafficking ring. The operation also used burner phones for communication, so there was no real paper trail, no records that could be subpoenaed. Everything was designed to be disposable, untraceable, and deniable. And it worked for years. During that time that it worked, not a single victim went public, and the NDAs held, the intimidation held, and the silence held. So how does something of this scale stay a secret? And you also could ask that question about all the Epstein stuff that's constantly in the news. How do people who are rubbing shoulders with this type of shit claim they didn't know? It's very confusing to me, and it makes me irate, okay? According to Brad Edwards, for this case specifically, the attorney representing the victims in the class action lawsuit, this was an Abercrombie-run sex trafficking organization, and this permeated throughout the entire company. This isn't just rich billionaires acting alone in private. It's an infrastructure, staff in A&F uniforms, greeting visitors at Jeffries' estate, recruiters identifying targets at Abercrombie stores, itineraries that look legitimate. All of this comes from the very basic level. So a lot of people had to have known. I mean, it's just the reality of it. When Abercrombie & Fitch responded to the allegations in 2023, the company said it was appalled and disgusted by the claims against Jeffries. And a spokesperson noted that his employment with the company ended in 2014, and they said Abercrombie & Fitch has zero tolerance for abuse, harassment, or discrimination of any kind. The company engaged an outside law firm to conduct an independent investigation, and as of late 2025, that investigation is ongoing. But in 2024, a federal court ruled that Abercrombie must cover Mike Jeffries' legal defense costs. The court determined that the civil allegations are connected to his former corporate role with that company. In other words, the courts see a connection between what Jeffries allegedly did and his position at Abercrombie & Fitch and the part of that infrastructure that he controlled. For over 20 years, Mike Jeffries built a company around the identification and recruitment of attractive young people. He created a culture where managers approached strangers based on their looks. He hired a photographer whose own conduct would later be questioned and accused. He built an empire on the worship of young, beautiful bodies, and took total advantage of that and created a sex trafficking empire internationally. There was silence for a while, but obviously all of this was going to eventually come out, and the first crack in the silence came in 2022. Netflix released White Hot, The Rise and Fall of Abercrombie & Fitch, which is a documentary directed by Allison Klayman, and the film examined the company's history of discrimination, exclusion, and toxic culture. The documentary interviewed former employees who described the pressure to maintain the look. It also featured Samantha Elauf, whose Supreme Court case had forced the company to change its policies. It also dissected Jeffries' infamous 2006 comments about only wanting to market to cool, good-looking people. White Hot was the first domino, but it did not include the sex trafficking allegations. That story had not broken yet. The next domino was the BBC investigation. Rhianna Croxford was a BBC investigations correspondent researching an entirely different story about the fashion industry in January 2021 when she found Barrett Paul. Paul was a former model who had become a life coach and wellness influencer, and he was working through his experiences with the fashion industry that he'd never shared publicly. When Croxford reached out, he told her he had a secret that he had never really told anyone before. After this followed a 2-year investigation by BBC's Panorama. Croxford and her team tracked down multiple victims, they obtained documents, they verified claims, and they built a case piece by piece. It was very meticulous journalism because it had to be. Obviously, this is a massive entity we're talking about. Jeffries had money, lawyers, and a massive reputation to protect, and every claim coming from BBC and the victims had to be bulletproof. BBC spoke to 12 men who described attending or organizing events for Jeffries and Smith that involved sex acts, sex events. 8 of them said they'd been recruited by James Jacobson, the man with the disgusting snakeskin nose patch. Then the team obtained emails between victims and recruiters. They found flight tickets and detailed travel itineraries that corroborated the victims' timelines. They interviewed dozens of other sources, including former household staff who confirmed that the events took place. And in October 2023, BBC's Panorama released The Abercrombie Guys, The Dark Side of Cool, which is a 59-minute documentary that laid out all the allegations in a disturbing detail. They also released a companion podcast called World of Secrets, The Abercrombie Guys. I love the idea of this massive expose having a companion podcast. It's f***ed up. I'm not sure why I'm laughing. And the men who spoke to the BBC described the things that we've talked about in today's video. For the first time, victims had a public platform, and for the first time, they were speaking on this. Federal authorities said that they were made aware of the allegations via media reports, meaning the BBC investigation, and prosecutors began investigating, and in January of 2024, they confirmed publicly that Mike Jeffries was under federal investigation for sex trafficking. By then, David Bradbury had filed his class action lawsuit, and more victims were coming forward every single week. And the investigation moved forward fairly quickly by federal standards. Witnesses were interviewed, documents were subpoenaed, grand jury proceedings took place behind closed doors, and in October of 2024, the dam broke. Mike Jeffries was arrested in West Palm Beach, Florida. They love West Palm Beach. These freak sex trafficking freakazoids. Matthew Smith was arrested with him, and James Jacobson was arrested in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. A 16-count indictment was unsealed in federal court in Central Islip, New York. 1 count of sex trafficking and 15 counts of interstate prostitution, each count tied to a specific victim. Of course, Jeffries pleaded not guilty. He was released on a $10 million bond and placed under house arrest. They always are. And then in December of 2024, Mike Jeffries' lawyers made an announcement that was, I don't know, some form of defense. They said that Mike Jeffries had dementia. And in April of this year, 2025, prosecutors and defense lawyers agreed he was not competent to stand trial and wanted a judge to place him in custody for 4 months so that he could be hospitalized and receive treatment that may allow his case to proceed. According to the defense, at least 4 medical professionals have examined Jeffries and concluded that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and the residual effects of a TBI, so a very severe diagnosis. The statement was that his cognitive issues were progressive and incurable, and that he would require around-the-clock care, and he could not, in the judgment of these doctors, understand the charges against him or assist in his own defense. So the 80-year-old former CEO, they said, would never regain his competency and cannot be restored to competency in the future. It's like Jeffrey Epstein magically ending up dead. There's no ending for any of the victims. It just, why does that happen, dude? He just got away with it until he's too old and his brain's full of too many holes to be able to stand up and take responsibility for his crimes. So that's kind of the way things were going for most of the year. But in December, this month, things kind of changed. After months of evaluation at a federal facility, the Bureau of Prisons reached a somewhat different conclusion. In a letter filed in federal court on December 10th, 2025, just a couple weeks ago as of filming this video, Blake Lott, the acting warden at the Federal Medical Center, said that Mike Jeffries is now competent to stand trial. A miracle! The Bureau of Prisons forensic evaluation found something different from what the defense doctors claimed. Magic. Despite the diagnosis of dementia and Alzheimer's, federal evaluators determined that Jeffries could understand the proceedings against him, he could communicate with his attorneys, and he could assist in his own defense. So that guy. Competency doesn't require perfect cognition. It requires a basic ability to understand what is happening and then participate in what is happening meaningfully. The 6th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution entitles defendants to a fair trial, with understanding the proceedings being an absolute requirement. You know, Founding Fathers moment. And the Bureau of Prisons believe now that Jeffries clears that bar. Now, obviously, the doctors on the defense team have pushed back as they found the client incompetent, and they are continuing to argue this. And a final competency hearing is now scheduled for early in 2026, probably in March. And if the court agrees with the Bureau of Prisons assessment, the trial will proceed, which would be awesome. So you have Mike Jeffries in fashion, Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, R. Kelly in music, and probably some other people that just haven't been exposed yet. Different industries, same basic structure, evil motherfuckers. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video or learned something, all these people, and I will see you in the next one.